The shadows of the desert are so magical that we completely forget the owners of the shadows. Mehmet Murat Yildirim. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. So, this week is going to be a slightly shorter than normal episode, or at least shorter than I have done the last couple of weeks. Was traveling for Father's Day weekend, went home to see my parents, all that kind of stuff, and since I've gotten home to record, we've had some people blaring music for several hours out in the parking lot across the street, which, I think they've stopped now, but it is approaching a pretty late hour for me, or at least later than I normally record. So I'm going to try to get through this fairly quickly and just get to a decent stopping place and then continue next week. That said, this week we are going to be continuing our study of Africa at 10,000 BC. In fact, this is going to be the last section, I guess, of this continent before we move on. And of course, these sections are going to cover Northern Africa. And I'm going to try and lay out who the peoples living in North Africa were and what they were kind of having to deal with. Because, again, as we've mentioned several times, this part of Africa is prone to climate change, regular climate change. It goes back and forth based on a number of factors, but it does oscillate between green and desert. Or I should say greener periods and then a desertification period. 10,000 BC, it is still in a green period, although that is going to slowly begin to change and then rapidly speed up. And we'll go over those changes later. But that being said, let's go ahead and get into specifics now. Now, this section is going to take a fair amount of kind of guesswork and some speculation on my part, because Africa is going to, obviously, as we've talked about, go over this climatic change, and we're not sure, honestly, where everyone is living at this point in time in this part of the continent. We have very good guesses, and we do have some evidence, but it is hard to know who those people are and what happened to them specifically. Many will migrate from this region to other regions of this continent, and where they end up at is something of a controversy, and just due to the nature of genetics and the study of it, we haven't been able to really nail down 100% accurate picture. We kind of have some broad strokes, but there's still a lot of guesswork that needs to be done. That said, I'm going to start on the western side of North Africa, which of course is today Morocco and Algeria and that kind of area. Now, I mentioned briefly in the section about the Niger-Congo language families how Mande was a language that has had some type of pushback in being included. There is now a kind of a group of thought with some evidence, I think decent evidence, that it maybe should not be considered a Niger-Congo language, at least not directly. It's obviously had enough overlap now that there is some back and forth between the words, but it may not have descended from the same proto-language. In fact, it may have been part of this other prior language. So I mentioned that it's very possible that the Mande people had to migrate to this part, to the part of Africa that they currently live in, due to climate change from this area. It's also possible that they, didn't come necessarily from the west coast. They could have come from the more central area. But that being said, We don't really know for sure, but we do know that there were some rivers, a lot more rivers covering this area, and I do believe that whoever was living there, it was definitely home to some group of humans. And I mentioned it prior, the main river that would have been in this area is the Tamanrasset River. Its main body of, I guess, the main, I guess, branch would come south from the Acacus Mountains of North Africa, and then it would move south and then begin to curve to the west. And there would be some other sources of water possibly draining out from some lakes or from the Hogar Mountains further in the, I guess, the center of the Sahara Desert. Now, it is also possible that some of the people living here are the ancestors to the modern Tuareg people. They are one of the groups that kind of live in Northern Africa, and they are very diverse in terms of skin color. They have some individuals with very dark black skin, and then they have some that are more in line with what you might think of someone from Arabia or very, very tanned, maybe Italians or Sicilians. But they have, like, different kind of hair. They're a very diverse group, and they share language. They have large families, and they are nomadic, which is, I think, something that has been traditional and continues to be traditional in this region. Numbers probably were a little bit better at this time, as makes sense. There's a lot more food. I also think that this area would have been a lot easier to live in than, say, the Senegal, Niger, or the Congo River basins, just because while it is green, it is not as dense in terms of forest. It's probably a lot easier to travel, just due to the layout of the land. You could just follow the river, a couple of miles north or south of it, and you'd be fine. And you're mostly dealing with the flat plain, unless you're living, of course, in the mountains, which I think most of the people living in them would probably move north along the coast once the Sahara does take that final turn to green. Of course, while travel may be easier and there may be more access to animals, forage for plant food would be a little bit harder just because of the nature of the area. There would be some trees, but there would not be anything close to like a forest or the rainforests further south. So more access to different types of animals probably, but much less types of greenery or leafage to eat or roughage to eat. Now, in terms of language, again, we don't know, who is speaking what at this time. It's very possible that most of the people living here do die out, and then just a small number, migrate to the border regions and then assimilate into, the people living in those border areas. I don't think that's the case. I think it is more than likely that one of those pseudo-Niger-Congo languages or very unrelated Niger-Congo languages probably were living in this area, and they came down and kind of took what land that was available, or not necessarily take it, but occupied it if no one else was living there. And that's about all we have for West Africa right now. But we will be getting back there. It is a region that is going to be important. We'll probably get back there to focus specifically in probably around the time that's like about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. There are a couple of things that are going to be very important in the central northern Africa. but that is, again, for a future episode. The next part of Northern Africa I want to focus on is the area around Lake Chad. Now, we talked about in the previous, warming period where Africa was, again, in a green phase. Lake Chad was massive. It's the largest it's ever been. It would be larger than it is today, but it's not close to what it was then. That said, it is going to be an excellent place for a number of different groups to kind of live around. There are people that live there today that are kind of speakers of a Chadic language. And these are spoken across Nigeria, and like Chad, Central African Republic, Cameroon. And it is considered Afro-Asiatic, so it is related to Semitic languages and Cushitic languages that we discussed. But it is split by it is split from Cushitic by the Nilo-Saharan languages and some groups of Niger-Congo languages. So that tells me that they moved into the region later, well after, they're probably one of the later groups that moved to this region, just based on the timeline and just how it's distributed. They definitely came from the north. There are some people that are coming from directly to the north. Those kind of the far western terminus of the Hogar Mountains. And they probably followed along the eastern edges of the Niger tributaries and then just moved down from there. Another group we mentioned when we were going over the Niger-Congo languages were the Cordofian languages. Now there are some of them that are Niger-Congo, but then there are some that are not. So it is a very complicated little area, but they are kind of surrounded by, Niger-Congo, Nilo-Saharan languages, and a little bit by the Chadic languages. And to go back to the Nilo-Saharan, the people in this part that we're discussing are the more Saharan of the Nilo-Saharan family, whereas last time we discussed the Nilotes. This time we're going to discuss the ancestors for the modern Saharan languages. Again, we're not quite sure of the age of this family. They could all be speaking a very similar language to the Nilotes, but I do think it's more of a language of neighbors as opposed to a direct family. But specifically, the languages spoken in the Sahel, which again is that border region, which is today a savanna, and it's a division between the lush jungles and forests of sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahara. The Sahel is that mid-range, whereas at this point in time, at 10,000 BC, the savanna was probably much further north, minus those big river areas that we talked about earlier. But the Saharan language, or the Proto-Saharan language, you're looking at these would be the ancestors of people that would also be along Lake Chad. They would be neighbors to the Chadic languages, as well as they would be neighbors in the west, and then their neighbors to the east are the Nilote speakers. And of course, to the north you have Afro-Asiatic speakers, and then possibly there's another unknown family that died out or got assimilated by one of these various groups that did live into the modern day. But today, the people that would be descendants of these people are going to be Kanuri is one of the groups. There are about 4 million or so of them, and this is the name of the language. There are several groups that are Kanuri speakers, and then you have Daza speakers and Teta speakers. And there are others that are in the east. I believe Zakawa is another big group. But the largest are Kanuri. They have 4 million. None of the other groups have over 1 million. So, again, we're pretty sure that this is that these are all related. These are definitely all related languages. What their original range was, we don't know. And Zakawa is actually the last eastern branch of the Saharan languages. The western is much larger, much more thing. I think there was another language that actually called Sagato, which is now extinct, unfortunately. It used to be spoken in Darfur and a few other places around there, but they by the 1990s that language completely died out. Virtually everyone that is in the area now speaks Arabic or a dialect of Arabic, which is unfortunate. But I do think they have some words still that they know, like in terms of what they were. But there are no native speakers anymore. Any remnants of that language are just what were studied and written down at this point. So we've gotten the far west. We've kind of got the south central part of the Sahara in northern Africa. Going to the north again, you have. In this little center region, you have the Acacus Mountains. These mountains are, there is rock art there dating to, I think they dated to about 6,000 years ago, which is well after this time frame. So it's possible they weren't living there yet. This could have been something that's happening as people are moving out of the region. Another important site to the east of the Hogar Mountains are the Acacus Mountains, which these are in the Ghat Desert in Libya. So these are kind of, if you look at a map of modern day Libya, they are right in the south west, right on the border of Algeria and Libya. Now there's rock art there that dates to 2,000 years before this, and there's more recent stuff there as well. Basically, this area has been kind of a stopping point for various groups, and somewhere that people do take refuge from the sun. There's a lot of rocky outcroppings. In fact, there's a very important find we're going to talk about in this region. We'll come back to this fairly soon, and I mean that in the grand scheme of things. I think it's about 5,000 BC. But this is part of the reason that we even have examples of, or what made people think that the Sahara was not always a desert. This was like one of the original things before we had any kind of like environmental studies for this kind of stuff. The reason for this is that there's rock art showing animals that would not be living in this region. The closest you'd be would be like 900 miles away, or like 1,500 kilometers, something like that. There are things like giraffes and elephants, which that's not they're native to Africa, but they are not close to these mountains, at least when they were found. Again, these are all things that are in the Sahel region, in the savannah plains. This thing's up in the mountains. You're not finding that stuff in this part. So this was kind of one of the things that people were discovering it. They're like, well, this is strong evidence that this region was not always so dry. This is, of course, a UNESCO heritage site. It was inaugurated in 1985 for that. Now, let's see. Of course, there are some, there's a lot of interesting rock formations. There are some thoughts that humans may have had a hand in like helping shape these. I don't know how much evidence there actually is of that, but that is one of the like big theories. Around the region. Now, of course, today most of this is occupied by modern Libyans, but again, we do have some Tuareg people still in the area as they move through, and that is important for, again, that future, kind of episode when we talk about a big discovery here when it comes to mummification. Now, I think that's probably a good place to stop actually for this week. Got a little over 20 minutes, which is, not a terrible length for this podcast, especially considering we don't have a lot of solid evidence to go on. It's a lot of guesswork for this part. Now, next week, we're going to continue moving to the east. We'll get back to the Nile Valley. We'll discuss who is living here, and then we are going to be moving out of Africa to the Southwest Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, the Sinai Peninsula, and then, of course, into the Levant and things like where modern-day Israel, Palestine, Syria, those countries are. And then we'll continue north from there, and then we'll go west. I'm not sure quite where we're going to go after the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula. Probably to the Mesopotamian region, Tigris and Euphrates. Those are probably the most important parts there. Once we're there, though, I really don't know where we're going to go. Should I go into India, or should I go north into the Caucasus, or to the northwest into the Acacus Mountains, or should I just curve up to Anatolia and then go into Europe? I don't know. If you guys have any feedback about what you'd like to listen to in those sections, please let me know. It's a good couple of month or so out, so please let me know if you have any requests, and I can take that in consideration. No feedback from the last episode, at least nothing specific. I did have a discussion with a regular listener about the Nilotes and why it's thought that they were so tall. There are a couple of theories for this, and we'll get back into that when we cover these people with more concrete evidence. But they are the first, one of the first groups to embrace pastoralism. So this leads them to have a lot of dairy, which is very good, of course, for bones and muscle density, at least if you're drinking a lot of it. And that's something you'll see in other cultures as well. At least some of it. It's really complicated, but again, future episode discussion. I am interested in feedback, so please reach out to me at my email, which is waradrevpod@gmail.com. That's waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can also reach me at Twitter, which I'll include the link to in the description of this episode on the various podcasting sites, Google, Spotify, and of course the main RSS feed. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I hope you enjoy this rushed episode, and I will see everyone hopefully next week. Thank you, and you have a great day. Goodbye.